This production has been made possible by a generous funding from the Nasser Al-Said Charitable Foundation.
كان طبيباً من أشهر الأطباء.
The Parisian gastroenterologist of fame and the passionate Egyptologist Dr. Maurice Bucaille enjoyed the merit of combining his scholarly knowledge of the biblical and Quranic texts with his ancient Egypt background to embark on a new journey that crowned his quest for harmonies of the Holy Writs with modern science. He wrote, "I had journeyed to Egypt during the second half of 1974 in search of various archaeological and medical data concerning certain pharaohs. In particular, I was after documents pertaining to the Exodus. My intention was to examine certain passages in the Bible and the Quran under the light of recent information provided by Egyptian archaeology. During my first visit to the royal mummy's room, I wondered whether or not my plans for this research would lead to conclusive findings, and whether I would be able to effectively justify the confidence the Egyptian authorities had placed in my project. My access to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where my studies were to be carried out, was due to President Sadat, who had given direct orders that I was to be allowed to perform any type of research, providing, of course, no damage was done to the mummies. In my own country, I was not officially entitled to carry out such research, nor was any endorsement given to me by the French government or a university. My presence at the museum, where I was very kindly granted every possible facility for research, was uniquely the result of personally contacting certain people. My initial contact was Mrs. Sadat, whom I knew through my medical practice. Her family had granted me its confidence after the successful treatment of a family member. I took the opportunity of informing Mrs. Sadat of my conclusions regarding the likelihood that a particular pharaoh may have taken part in the Exodus. At that time, however, my theories were supported merely by data drawn from my study of history, archaeology, and hieroglyphic texts. She gracefully agreed in no time to present a request on my behalf to President Sadat. With extreme gratitude, I later paid a visit to the President himself. At the time, there was not a single harbinger that might have helped me foresee the developments that were to follow. At first, I was, of course, fascinated by the outward appearance of both pharaohs when I entered the mummies room of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in 1974. In that year, 3,212 years had elapsed since the death of Ramses II. The only parts of the body of Ramses II that were visible to visitors in 1974 were the head and the left hand, the rest being draped with coarse linen not unlike burlap. The mummy was laying supine in an open coffin, visible through the glass sides of a rectangular display case with a removable glass cover. How the mighty had fallen! The sight of the hand, a symbol of power and force, led me to imagine Ramses II as a young sovereign and warrior during the first 20 years of his rule. The purpose of my own project was to examine the possibilities of making new discoveries and to extend the research to branches of medicine that had not yet been included. The research was to focus on the remains of two pharaohs. Mernptah, research in the field of forensic medicine, was to prove of great value in determining the cause of his death, and Ramses II, thought by many biblical scholars to have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. It seemed to me that the experts' arguments were weak in terms of factual evidence, and that precise data on the condition of the pharaohs at the end of their lives could cast light on the matter, providing indisputable evidence. Our earlier studies had already shown that the mummy of Ramses II, and likewise other pharaohs' mummies, had suffered serious damage before the bodies of numerous kings were discovered in the necropolis at Thebes nearly a century ago. In the case of Ramses II, the damage was twofold. First, structural, the extent of which had already been determined by X-rays, and secondly, biological, the causes of which had already been discovered as well. I discussed these problems several times during my talks with President Sadat and those around him. On January 23, 1976, President Sadat announced his decision to entrust the mummy of Ramses II to France. He asked me personally to announce the measures that needed to be taken to rescue the other deteriorating mummies after Ramses' stay in Paris. The Pharaoh arrived at Le Bourget Airport on September 26, 1976. From the airport, the mummy had been transferred to the Museum of Anthropology for hospitalization in one of the specially prepared rooms. On June 29, 1977, Paris Match reported that the truck containing the packing case and its occupant was ordered to pass by one of his two Luxor obelisks at Place de la Concorde, so that the ancient monarch's soul could contemplate his glory inscribed on the stone in dithyrambic terms. Operation Ramses lasted almost 8 months and was directed by Christian de Roche-Noblecourt, curator of Egyptian antiquities at the Louvre, and by Professor Lionel Bellew, director of the Museum of Anthropology. Eventually, the genuine French passion about Egyptology, as dubbed by a French newspaper, had inevitably sparked a clash of interest among the doctors and the curators. The first casualty was Bukai, who had been totally denied the honor of participating in the rescue of Ramses' mummy. Only after the conclusions of his team's research were made public in 3 lectures given upon invitation from the Department of Egyptian Antiquities at the Louvre in autumn 1975, and the other 2 at the Institute of Human Paleontology in May 1976. By summer of 1976, Bukai's book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science, was already setting a stir in motion in some Parisian circles. And as Dr. Bukai had been deprived the honor of being at the reception of the mummy, he single-handedly initiated its treatment 2 years earlier. He was denied even attendance at the official farewell ceremony given to the celebrated Pharaoh Tuesday morning, the 10th of May, 1977, at Le Bourget Airport. Medical investigations conducted on the mummy of Ramses II in Paris have confirmed the cause of his death: old age. By the time Ramses II died, at the platinum age of 90, following a glorious rule that lasted almost 67 years, 1279 to 1212 BC, he had apparently outlived 12 of his sons. So it was his 13th, Mernptah, who succeeded him to be the 4th in the line of the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty. At the time of his ascension, he was probably nearly 60 years old. Mernptah's reign was short-lived, perhaps only 9 or 10 years, as well as rather dull in comparison with that of his star predecessor. According to the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, he ruled from 1213 until 1203 BC. Mernptah's tomb is marked KV8 at the Valley of the Kings on the Nile's west bank, opposite of today's Luxor, ancient Thebes. When his mummy was not found in his tomb by 19th century archaeologists, they concluded that his body had drowned and lost forever in the water walls of the Red Sea while pursuing the fleeing Israelites according to the Old Testament's Exodus. But the theory had been refuted when the mummy of Mernptah was discovered by Victor Loret in 1898 in the Valley of the Kings. The study of both the Quranic and biblical narrations is specifically interesting here, mainly because the 2 narrations share a lot in common. There are certainly divergences, but the biblical narration has a considerable historical value. It does help to identify the pharaoh, or rather, the 2 pharaohs in question. This hypothesis, which starts with the Bible, is complemented by the information contained in the Quran. Modern data are added to these 2 scriptural sources. Bukai singles out one major discrepancy in the narration of both texts regarding the fate of the pharaoh's body. The writer of Exodus tells us that after the Israelites crossed the sea without wetting their feet, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Exodus 23. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Exodus 28 through 29. So the Israelites escaped, and the Pharaoh perished. But his body was rescued and found, a very important detail not mentioned in the biblical narration. We read in the Quran, chapter 10, verses 90 to 92. Thus we caused the children of Israel to pass in safety through the divided sea. Then Pharaoh and his host followed them, in ruthless injustice and aggression, until, when the drowning waters overwhelmed him, he said, I believe that there is no God but the one in whom the children of Israel have believed. And I am now of those who are Muslims, in willing submission to God alone. It was said, Now you believe, while before you have truly disobeyed your Lord, and you were ever of those who sowed corruption? Rather today we shall deliver you, preserving you in your body only, so that you will become a sign for those who come after you, that God is exalted in his power, for indeed many of the people are heedless of our signs. As a young man, Moses, after slaying an Egyptian, fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. Exodus 15. Bukai points out an important detail mentioned in Exodus 23. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died. Exodus identifies that king being the one who ordered the Hebrews, by forced labor, to build new cities. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. Exodus 11.
During 1292 through 1290 BC, Ramses built the city of Pur-Ramses, House of Ramses, to serve as his northern capital. The city rested on the banks of the farthest tributary of the river Nile to the east of Egypt before desertification landfilled it. It is generally conceived that the House of Ramses city had been the birthplace of Prophet Moses. The remnants of the city, renamed Kantir, are located 55 kilometers to the east of the modern city of Zagazig.
Bukai concludes that Exodus, with the returning 80-year-old Moses, could only have taken place during the reign of Ramses' successor. So, one Pharaoh died during Moses' stay at Midian, while the other perished pursuing the fleeing Israelites. Not a single Pharaoh for Moses then, but two: Ramses II, Pharaoh of the oppression, and Mernptah, Pharaoh of the Exodus. Having published the results of his examination of the mummies of both pharaohs, freely conducted in the Cairo Museum during 1974 and 1975, Dr. Bukai had headed on the afternoon of February 17, 1976, to the French National Academy of Medicine to present a paper entitled Application of Medical Methods to the Examination of Pharaonic Mummies, in which he introduced the conclusions reached by his Egyptian Franco team. In his book of 1987, Mummies of the Pharaohs, Modern Medical Investigations, Bukai dissects in detail these conclusions. He says, "It was apparent to my colleague Michel Durgon and me that mummification had been carried out with perfect success on the body. Visual examination of it was not enough. However, what we needed was material proof. This we obtained by microscopic analysis of a tiny fragment of the mummy. It was examined under the microscope by Professors Jacques Mignot and Michel Durgon. They were thus able to show the perfect preservation of the smallest anatomical details visible, the transversal striations of the fibrilla, as we have already seen on other mummies. For it to have retained these microscopic features to this day, the body must have been embalmed while in good condition. Otherwise, decay and putrefaction would have set in." Bukai continued, "The lacuna in the right part of the thorax may well have been the result of an injury sustained during the subject's lifetime. The cranial lacuna is of great forensic importance. Its presence may suggest a craniocerebral lesion received during the subject's lifetime, a fracture with a penetrating wound seriously injuring the brain. In all likelihood, this lesion caused a very rapid death." After grueling research, the final conclusion was reached in Bukai's words. This would have brought on death very quickly, and the body had been submerged before or after the Pharaoh was killed. Whatever the case, he does not appear to have stayed in the water for long. I have searched for a contradiction of any kind between our medical observations and the narrations of the Exodus contained in the book of Exodus in the Bible and the Quran. But I can find no argument to oppose the theory I hereby maintain. Given the present state of our knowledge, the only valid hypothesis that can be advanced is that Merenptah, Ramses II's successor, met a tragic end during the Exodus. This has been formally proved by medical examination and fits perfectly with the passage in the Quran on the rapid retrieval of the body. Rather today, we shall deliver you, preserving you in your body only, so that you will become a sign for those who come after you, that God is exalted in his power, for indeed, many of the people are heedless of our signs. Here is a material presence of the mummified body of the man who knew Moses, resisted his pleas, pursued him as he took flight, and lost his life in the process. His earthly remains were saved by the will of God from destruction to become a sign to posterity, as it is written in the Quran. Bukai wraps up his argument with a piece of advice for those who seek, in modern data, a proof of the veracity of the Holy Scriptures. He asserts, they will find a magnificent illustration of the verses of the Quran when they see the retrieved body of the Exodus Pharaoh by simply visiting the Royal Mummy's Room in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo.